Welcome to the news with goldsilverbitcoin.com. My name is Justin O'Connell. I'll be your host, and you can find these stories and others at goldsilverbitcoin.com. Today we're going to go over our first story, which is the UN chief saying that coronavirus provides a rare and short window of opportunity to push zero carbon. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres wants global leaders to use the pandemic recovery to create a more sustainable society and as quickly as possible, calling for letting fossil fuel companies collapse and using taxpayer stimulus money to fund green jobs. Guterres noted this during the Petersburg Virtual Dialogue, which is a 2-day virtual international conference on global warming. He said at that conference that coronavirus provides a rare and short window of opportunity to accelerate the International Agency's 2030 agenda, which is essentially a sustainability agenda. Quote, coronavirus has exposed the fragility of our societies and economies to shocks, Guterres said. The only answer is brave, visionary, and collaborative leadership. The same leadership is needed to address, quote, the looming existential threat of climate disruption. These are dark days, but they are not without hope, he said. We have a rare and short window of opportunity to rebuild our world for the better. Let us use the pandemic recovery to provide a foundation for a safe, healthy, inclusive, and more resilient world for all people. This is in a bureaucrat's eyes, and the way in which this world is formulated is not up for discussion or debate at a public discourse level. This will be instituted from the top down. And in this guy's mind, world peace is essentially the absence of opposition to this agenda. Guterres insisted that U.S. taxpayer stimulus packages must create green jobs instead of bailing out the energy sector. Where taxpayers' money is used to rescue businesses, it must be also creating green jobs and sustainable and inclusive growth. It must not be bailing out outdated, polluting, carbon-intensive industries. The Paris Agreement was made possible, he says, thanks to the participation of the U.S. and China. Without the contribution of the big emitters, all of our efforts would be doomed, he said. Like the coronavirus, greenhouse gases respect no boundaries, he added. Isolation is a trap. No country can succeed alone. The next story we're going to go over today is central banks may cease targeting inflation rates. The Federal Reserve may stop targeting inflation, the measure of price increases for goods and services over time, as the coronavirus response threatens economic depression a la the 1930s. The Great Lockdown has led to 26.4 million jobless claims in the U.S. through 2018, which is a record. We've seen some reports saying that number of unemployed is likely around 40 million or 8.75% and quickly increasing. These are unprocessed claims or claims that were not approved. Either way, job losses amid this recent crisis, the coronavirus response crisis, have wiped out all the job gains since the Great Recession, which happened in 2008 during the global financial recession. Pushan Dutt, a professor of economics and political science at INSEAD, which I'm not sure what that is, but it's a agency with a bureaucratic acronym as a name, says central banks will need to shift policies. Quote, they have put a lot of weight on inflation. They are much less worried about unemployment. The next generation of central bankers who take over would have grown up during the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. These central bankers will put, in my opinion, more weight on reducing unemployment, and they will worry far less about inflation. This includes the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, or the Federal Reserve. With businesses worldwide having been shut down, small businesses in particular, in the United States, big driver of jobs are small businesses, there won't be many options for people to get jobs, and if it becomes policymaker goals to target employment rates, they can either cook the books, as already happens, or they can give people public jobs, so jobs with the government will be one option. And so then we'll have a ballooning public sector of people with jobs on the front lines, all essential. Central banks heretofore, such as the ECB, the Federal Reserve, Federal Bank of Australia, and Bank of England, have developed inflation targeting practices in their monetary policy. Joseph Gagnon, also says that he believes bankers will need to target employment rates. Gagnon is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He believes that this targeting of employment will first happen outside of the United States. Quote, "For the Fed, employment has always been an equal goal to inflation, so that won't change. But I think it might change elsewhere where employment hasn't had the same status. And it should change, frankly, because I think they're actually both equally important goals for central banks." Gabrielle Stern, head of Global Strategy Services and Emerging Markets Macro Research at Oxford Economics, said that COVID-19 crisis would almost certainly shift focus from price inflation targets. He said, quote, "I think coronavirus will definitely have a big impact on inflation and views toward policy. I think it could tip the monetary frameworks over the edge. Most central banks do inflation targeting, but the problem with inflation targets is that they are both too high and low." Stern went on to say that if you have monetary policy trying to hit inflation at 2%, what we've seen is central banks just failing to do so because they haven't got enough space on the downside. Imagine if inflation was on average 4% and interest rates on average 4%. So in interest rates on average 4%. That would mean when you get a nasty shock, you can lower interest rates and you wouldn't get to zero and think, oh my goodness, we can lower interest rates anymore, which is where all the central bankers now find themselves. He continued, "The point is, inflation targets just aren't fit for the purpose at the moment. I think the credibility of inflation targeting regimes is really low at the moment, as low as it's ever been, to the point where they're redundant. Financial markets have been way better at predicting inflation than central banks are. The whole framework now has lower credibility internationally than it has since inflation targets were started in the early 90s. The crisis would make it more difficult to meet inflation targets during the pandemic." So the way I read this is that whereas historically Federal Reserve and other international central banks have been able to reasonably target inflation rates and come within a reasonable distance of those rates moving forward with booming inflation, with increasing inflation, out of control inflation, perhaps even hyperinflation in some societies, it would just look silly if these central banks were targeting the inflation rates. And so employment is actually something that I imagine is a little bit easier to control, perhaps even manipulate the numbers on. And particularly that's because you can create public jobs for these people, so bureaucratic gigs and jobs, in order to keep those employment rates down. Of course, there must be a discussion about what those jobs are, because once you have a ballooning bureaucracy, you can also have government overreach quite easily. So far we've gone over that the UN is essentially calling on all nations to implement sustainability measures. The nature of these sustainability measures have not been debated at a public level in any real manner, namely the Agenda 2030 to get carbon down to zero by 2030. And then we've got central banks who are going to ditch inflation. I believe that's because we're going to see runaway inflation and they won't be able to target anything near what we're going to be seeing moving forward. Beyond that, the next story we're looking at is that total unemployment claims could be as high as 8.25% of Americans. And this is regarding a study that was done by EPI. So with unemployment claims above 26 million, reports have surfaced that state UI systems cannot handle the volume of applications, which leaves millions of laid off and furloughed workers unable to receive unemployment benefits. In light of such underrepresentation in these official employment numbers, the Economic Policy Institute, ERI, conducted a study that revealed millions additional would have filed for unemployment if not for the difficulties they found during that process. According to the survey, a potential 8.9 to 13.9 million additional people would have filed for benefits, but they found the process quite too difficult. The higher end of that puts unemployment then at 8.25%, 8.275%, which is nearly double the current official statistic of 4.4%. And the survey estimates about half of the potential UI applications were approved for benefits. The online survey, which was released on Tuesday, shows that for every 10 people who successfully filed for unemployment benefits, 3 were not able to complete the process, and 2 more decided not to try because the process was too difficult, quote. EPI estimates that an additional These findings imply the official count of unemployment insurance claims likely drastically understates the extent of employment reductions and the need for economic relief during the coronavirus crisis, according to the authors, whose findings include the 5 weeks of claims since March 15th, which I believe is the day after California locked down. The poll was conducted between April 13th through the 24th, and it included 25,000 U.S. adult internet users. More than 68% of the participants did not apply for unemployment as they managed to keep their jobs. More than 15% were ineligible for benefits. 1.6% of the applicants overall were rejected. EPI said that some states may have been ill-equipped to process applicants with expanded eligibility. EPI used Google Surveys, which collects responses from visitors to news and other internet sites, to ask 25,000 people, quote, "Did you apply for unemployment benefits in the last 4 weeks?" So then Kevin Hassett, an economic advisor, told CNBC that, quote, "You're looking at something like minus 20% to 30% in the second quarter." Hassett anticipates unemployment to reach 16 to 17%. And he doesn't think that's the worst case scenario. Around 2008, we lost 8.7 million jobs during the whole thing. Right now, we're losing that many jobs about every 10 days. Now for something a little bit different, we're going to look and zoom in on a African country, Sudan, which is currently being gripped by an acute inflation crisis. And inflation has climbed from 70% to 80% in 1 month. I think we will see this story play out across Africa, then Latin America and Asia, before it creeps into European Union as well as the United States. So Sudan is suffering from an acute inflation crisis. The annual inflation rate has ballooned to 80%, the government said Tuesday, with an annual inflation rate now at 81.64% in March, which is compared to 71.35% in February, according to the Central Bureau of Statistics. Food prices are soaring in the East African nation. After authorities increased bread prices, one Sudanese pound now buys only a 50-gram loaf of bread, compared to 70 grams before. The Sudanese stand in line for hours to buy staple foods or gas up their car. An economic crisis hit the country in the year since protests led to the military ouster of Omar al-Bashir after a 30-year rule. The anti-Bashir protests flared up in late 2018 in response to the government tripling bread prices and then calling for more power. The coronavirus outbreak has hit poor economies quite hard. Sudan's economic woes were further compounded by the coronavirus outbreak and the Great Lockdown. So really the global response to the coronavirus outbreak, which is, as the IMF has called it, the Great Lockdown. Sudan's economy has also been subject to U.S. sanctions, while in 2011 the oil-rich South Sudan split off. Despite Washington lifting some sanctions in 2017, the country still remains on a U.S. blacklist as a state sponsor of terrorism, and a transitional administration took power in August and is pushing Sudan's international standing and to boost ties with the U.S. All right, those are the stories we're looking at today at goldsilverbitcoin.com. Check us out at goldsilverbitcoin.com. We've got precious metals for sale, as well as we'll be adding emergency preparedness kits coming up, coffee, and anything else we think is a high quality product for our readers. So thank you so much and have a great day.